We had just adopted a 6-month-old standard poodle puppy named Basbo. Before we had adopted this puppy, however, we had already made arrangements to go on a 2-week family vacation out west, so we knew we were going to have to leave our dog behind. Not wanting to burden anybody else with the responsibility of house training our dog, though that would have been nice, we decided to kennel him. Elliot and I were designated to be the family members to take Basbo to the kennel the morning of our vacation. So Basbo and Elliot and I got into the car. And as we were driving to the kennel, Elliot was in the back seat talking and singing and humming and whistling and strumming his air guitar and burping the alphabet and tapping his pencil and patting his legs. We got into the kennel, we dropped the dog off, we said goodbye, and we got back in the car. And as we were driving back home to get the other family members, I noticed that Elliot's allergies were starting to act up. It was getting very quiet in the back seat. What's wrong, buddy? Mom, can anything bad happen to a dog in a kennel? Now, a good mother at this point would simply lie to her child and say, why no, dear, nothing bad can happen to a dog in a kennel. But I have this image that I want to be like those mothers in the movies who always have the most beautiful thing to say to their children at these moments. Things that their children will carry with them for the rest of their lives. Like, why no, dear, kennels are perfectly safe places. And if you keep Basbo tucked in your heart, he'll know that you're the one watching out for him. Gee, Mom, thanks. But that's never how it works at my house because I can never think of the right thing to say at these moments. So as I was driving down the road, I was trying to imagine what my 2 older and wiser sisters might say to their children, or what Mary Poppins would say, or Mike and Carol Brady. And then it occurred to me that I could tell Elliot a funny story that I know about a dog who had been to the kennel. And before I knew what was happening, I'd sort of forgotten that Elliot was in the back seat as I was driving ahead, and my mouth just drove right into the story of Buddy, an amorous, frolicsome, devoted 10-year-old black Labrador retriever who belonged to our cousins Sandy and Gary and their, at the time, 8-year-old baseball-loving son, Mark. Sandy and Gary were good Minnesotans, so normally they took their vacations up to the lake. They'd go hunting and camping and fishing and boating, and of course they'd take their dog Buddy right along with them. But this year, they'd been invited to the wedding of a good friend of theirs out in Washington, D.C. So they decided that this was a good opportunity for them to take their 8-year-old son to see the capital of the United States of America. That, however, meant that they couldn't take Buddy with them. They looked for a sitter for Buddy, but no one was available, so reluctantly they made a reservation at a kennel. I don't know if you know this about kennels, but kennels typically have very small slivers of time available for you to drop your dog off or pick your dog up, like 8:10 to 8:17 in the morning, and then again from 4:23 to 4:27 in the afternoon. I think this is a very clever money-making device for the kennels because by the time you get your dog into the kennel, it'll probably be a good 3 or 4 months before you can find time in your schedule to pick the dog up between 4:23 and 4:27. Well, this was one of those kennels. They weren't open on Sunday, and Sandy and Gary were scheduled to fly back from Washington, D.C. on a Sunday. Not wanting to leave Buddy in the kennel any longer than necessary, they decided to ask Gary's sister Monica if she would be willing to come on Saturday and pick Buddy up from the kennel. They said if she would bring Buddy back to Sandy and Gary's house, made sure that there was plenty of food and water and that the doggy door was open, that he could get in and out of the door, and that he'd be able to take care of himself for the next 24 hours till Sandy and Gary and Mark got back. So the plan was set in motion. Sandy and Gary and Mark dropped Buddy off at the kennel. Then they flew off to Washington, D.C. The following Saturday, Monica came. She picked Buddy up at the kennel at exactly 4:26 in the afternoon. She brought him home, made sure that there was plenty of food, there was plenty of water, the doggy door was open. She played with Buddy for a bit, said goodbye, and drove off. 24 hours later, Sandy and Gary and Mark flew back to Minnesota. Their flight was right on time. They jumped into their car, drove as fast as they legally could to get home to see Buddy. They were so excited. They drove into the driveway, walked up to the door, expecting Buddy to be sitting, wagging his tail, ready to lick their faces on the other side of the door. They opened the door, and there was no Buddy. Now, this worried them until quickly they found Buddy in the kitchen, and their worries all melted to the back of their mind as they got on their knees and they rubbed their affection all over Buddy. Well, then they started to unload the car. And as Gary was walking in and out of the house, he noticed that he didn't hear the clinking of Buddy's tags, because normally Buddy would follow him in and out of the house. There was Buddy lying on the living room floor. Peculiar. Well, once they had unpacked their suitcases, Mark decided that it was time for some baseball practice. Now, normally, when Mark was ready to play baseball, Buddy would dash out the doggy door and take his place in the outfield, ready to catch Buddy's baseballs right in his teeth. So, this time, Buddy just sort of gradually meandered out there. Well, Mark tossed a baseball up into the air. He hit it into the outfield. Buddy went running. He caught Mark's baseball right in his teeth and promptly lay down on the grass and started to chew the baseball rather than retrieving it to Mark. Peculiar and annoying. Sandy decided maybe he would feel better if he went for a walk. So she opened the closet door that held Buddy's leash. She rattled the chain to the leash, which was normally Buddy's cue to come running for the walk, but Buddy just sat on the kitchen floor. Well, Gary reached down and he attached the leash to Buddy's collar, and he tried to coax Buddy along, but Buddy just sat on the floor. So then Gary began to drag him along the kitchen floor until it looked like he was trying to walk a dog that had been to the taxidermist rather than to a kennel for a week. Well, finally, they decided to leave him alone. They knew that some dogs pouted when they got back from the kennel. Maybe that was what was wrong with him. But later that night, as they were sitting around, Gary looked at Buddy and he said, you know, he just isn't acting like himself. And Sandy looked over and said, he didn't even look like himself. And without another word, Sandy and Gary both got up. They went over to Buddy. They flipped him over on his back, and they started to look for the little white streaks that came up from his paws. And there were no white streaks. In unison, Sandy and Gary said to one another, "It's not Buddy!" Immediately, 4 thoughts raced through their heads. Number 1, it's not Buddy, which means Buddy could be at somebody else's house. And what if that somebody is a Ted Kaczynski sort of somebody, or Charles Manson sort of somebody, or a Kardashian sort of somebody? He could be anywhere. Their second thought was, it's not Buddy, which means we have somebody else's dog. We could be arrested for dog napping. We're going to spend the next 9 years of our lives in jail. What's going to happen to Mark? Their third thought was, it's not Buddy, which means this dog has been wandering around in our house alone for the last 24 hours. That gave them that same creepy sort of feeling that you get when you open your suitcase and discover that the security guard has been rummaging around in your underwear looking for drugs. Oh. Their fourth thought, it's not Buddy, and the kennel doesn't open for another 24 hours and 17 minutes. They can't solve this problem. Immediately, they began searching through the house, smelling and looking for signs of urination and destruction. The house appeared to be undamaged, which freed their minds to consider other sorts of problems, like, what should we call this creature? Knowing that a name creates a certain kind of attachment between humans and animals, they needed a name that would make it perfectly clear that this was going to be a short-term relationship. So they decided to call the dog Not Buddy. Then they were faced with the question about petting Not Buddy, because they felt when they petted Not Buddy that they were cheating a little bit on Buddy somehow. By the same token, they felt a little bit sorry for this dog. So they finally agreed that they would only pet Not Buddy every 4 hours, and at that, for 43 seconds at a time. Finally, it was time for bed. Sandy and Gary got into their bed, and before long, Not Buddy came padding into the room. He sat at the side of the bed and now Buddy got to sleep at the foot of Sandy and Gary's bed. But Sandy shot up in bed and said, "That is crossing the line. Imagine sleeping with another dog. We are not going to sleep around on Buddy." So Not Buddy was banished from the bedroom and slept on the other side of the door. Well, the next morning they got up bright and early, and they were at the kennel at exactly 8:07 when it opened. They came walking Not Buddy in on a leash, and they told the receptionist that there'd been some sort of mix-up, that this apparently wasn't their dog. Something had gone wrong. How do you know? Well, we know our dog. Our dog has little white streaks that come up from his paws, and our dog doesn't act like this. And do you have any photo ID? Yeah, so Sandy and Gary got out their wallets and their photo ID for the dog. No, we don't have. Who's got photo ID for their dog? No. How do you expect me to believe you? It's not our dog. Finally, they convinced her to at least go to the back and check. 10 minutes later, she came out. "Looks like we got your Buddy back there. But you're going to have to give us Raleigh before we're going to bring Buddy back." You mean you're going to hold Buddy hostage back there until we give you Not Buddy? You betcha. So they gave her Not Buddy. She took Not Buddy back. 10 minutes later, she came out with another black Labrador retriever who came running up to Sandy and Gary. They quickly checked, and there were the little white streaks on its paws. They decided not to thank the receptionist, but to take Buddy home where he belonged. Now, at this point in my story, I suddenly realized that, oh yes, Elliot's in the back seat of the car. So I said to him, "Elliot, you see, everything worked out just fine. Buddy got home." Wow! Waterfalls were gushing down Elliot's cheeks as he was staring at a pocket photo of Basbo. Oh, maybe Mary Poppins wouldn't have told that story. Oh, Elliot got over the story 2 weeks later when we picked Basbo up from the kennel. But I had a chance to redeem myself as a mother 3 years later. Church. Now, they had promised 2 brides that they could still have their weddings in the old Centrum, one in April of 2008 and one in June. And so Marie Beeson had kindly agreed to see the buildings through those weddings. And so the time came for the April wedding. And Marie walked into the sanctuary to prepare, and she looked up, and the ceiling had started to buckle from years of rain damage. So she did the only thing she knew to do, which is to rope off the pews underneath that part of the ceiling and to say her prayers. And so the April wedding came, and it went, and nothing happened, and the ceiling held. So the time came for the June wedding. And again, Marie walked in, and it looked like the ceiling hadn't changed much, so she roped off the pews again and said her prayers. And the June wedding started. And the bridesmaids all came down the aisle. And then the maid of honor came. It was the bride's Great Dane. Yeah. And then here came the bride, and the ceiling held, and the wedding was lovely. Now, the next morning, Marie had agreed to meet the bride and groom's parents to finish the cleanup from the night before. And so they walked into the sanctuary and discovered that somewhere between the hours of 12:30 and 8 a.m., the ceiling had fallen into the pews. The old Centrum had met its final obligation and then collapsed. Well, about this time, our friend Reverend Sachs from the 1970s, he was down in French Lick visiting the newly renovated West Baden Springs Hotel. And as he walked around admiring the splendor and the beauty of that building, he kept hearing the name Bill Cook. And he said, "Cook, cook, cook. Central Avenue needs a cook." An angel must have taken those words to Bill Cook's ears. You see, the friends of the historic Central Avenue Church, they hadn't given up yet. Indiana Landmarks wanted to buy the building and use it for their office space and as a performing arts venue, but they needed other resources to fund the renovation. So, for a third time, the witnesses prepared their testimonies. And Judy O'Bannon and Marsh Davis gathered together a brass ensemble. And they met one day with Bill Cook and his wife Gail and their son Carl. Now Gail has a little thing for domes. And so all five of them crawled up there and admired whatever it is you would admire up there on your hands and knees. And then they went into the old Sunday school rotunda and the brass ensemble played. And then they came into the sanctuary. And a trumpeter stood on either side of the balcony. And they played back and forth to one another. And Judy turned and looked at Bill Cook and saw the corners of his mouth turn up. So after they were finished, they all went into the parking lot, and Judy went into her car and sat impatiently, and Bill and Marsh stood and talked for the longest time. And finally, Marsh came over to Judy. He said to tell the lady she's got her building. And the building got its cook. And look at the results. Perhaps an angel has taken our applause to Bill Cook's ears where he resides now. Kids, you better go get those buckets because they're not needed here any longer. If these walls could talk, I think she'd say this. So many memories buried in these boxes. But now my pews are polished, and my dome's been tightened, and there's no more pigeon poop. Somehow, I just know that whoever walks through these doors in the future, no matter what their purpose, my renewed beauty and splendor will call them to love with all of their hearts and souls and mind and strength. And as for the people who were inside me, well, they've learned my walls are no barrier to being a church. You see, they heard Bishop Reams say that whenever one person's need comes in contact with another person's ability to meet that need, there you set up an altar. So you see, the altar that once stood here has been transcended, and it lives and is rebuilt every time a neighbor is loved by someone who was hugged by these walls.
Wow.